If you study the history of America carefully, and I believe 10 out of 100 historians are more likely to tell you America, this country, was founded on this Christian principle. So in other words, we know since the beginning of the country, the evangelical communities has been rooting so much about the people's morality and also why we should keep this country this way. Of course, fast forward. In the year of 2023, America is standing at the crossroads, not just politically speaking, but meanwhile, being a Christian or preserving this Christian value is also facing some challenges. However, did you know that not only this American Christian impact is changing the society within America, but meanwhile, it also can link to other continents as well. For example, how about the continent of Africa? And to be specific, how about some of the countries in Africa today are also experiencing this, what we call American evangelical help in order to change the social and also the cultural identities. So that's why today in this episode, we need to talk about how the Christian movement today is happening in some of the countries of Africa, and also it could change the fate of the countries. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite Caleb. And again, Caleb is a Nigerian journalist, and he's the co-founder and a managing editor at Minority Africa. Well, Caleb, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much, Will. Glad to be here.
Well, Caleb, again, I'm very excited about our conversation, again, mainly based on the article that you recently published, which is entitled, How U.S. Evangelicals Help Homophobia Flourish in Africa. Now, can you help us to understand, again, as we mentioned before, when we talk about this Christian movement or Christian value, it's no stranger that America today is standing at the crossroads. Now, in the article, I want to start with the country of Uganda. You mentioned, and I quote, Uganda's parliament is set to debate a new anti-gay bill recently, and as the country president called for a medical opinion on the deviance of the homosexuals. Number one, what is the challenge for the LGBT community in Uganda today, and why do you think such movement is linked to Americans' evangelicals movement? What do you say to that?
Thanks, Phil. I think that the fundamental challenge, of course, is homophobia, always homophobia. And I guess the distinct thing perhaps about places like Uganda is how it manifests, but the fabric of the problem is still the same, right? And just some context, right? You've talked about this article was published 2 days before the parliament debated the anti-gay bill, which was eventually passed. And I think only 2 members of parliament even opposed it, but it was like an overwhelming yeses to nos. And this bill stipulates the death penalty for the crime of what they call aggravated homosexuality, and also would imprison a landlord for I think 5 or 10 years if you had to rent your house to a gay person. So it's pretty draconian, right? So I guess in that way, that's of course a fundamental problem of that queer people in Uganda face, which is the fact that there is state-sponsored, state-backed, and institutionalized, and probably now even legal violence against them, or legal ways of enacting violence against them. And it's not to say that the violence is new, it's just to say that the problem with a bill like this is the fact that it will now be legalized. And I'm Nigerian, which you talked about. And in 2014, I believe, we passed a similar, not as draconian now in hindsight when we think about it, but we did pass the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act. And what happened after that act was passed is a similar thing that we've seen happen in Uganda when similar bills have been debated, is even if nobody quote unquote gets tried under that law, just the debate as a whole already creates this climate that essentially legitimizes and calls for, and perhaps even rewards, to a great extent, violence, or releasing the names of queer people or exposing queer people. It plays there's a system in which the state then starts to reward these kind of acts. But what's really peculiar about it is, you pointed out, it's not essentially, it's not entirely, because the rhetoric of it is not entirely, peculiar to Africa, right? And if you kind of like trace where have we seen this kind of like similar rhetoric before, you land in the US, which is sort of like the reason why I wrote that piece, because even from the days of like Puritan Christianity, so in the 17th century when, of like European colonialism on like American land, or what would become the US, there were like a lot of, they had, when you sort of like look at the sodomy cases that were tried then, you would sort of see Christianity being front and center. So it's the same language, you must note. They would like tell people, or they would like say people were corrupting the population. They would use sort of like terms like the same thing we're seeing now as like deviance. They would also, there was a particular example I found of a person who I think was called something, I think Joseph or something, whose name I don't remember fully, who was sentenced, I think, to being beaten because he tried to have like homosexual relations with another man. But what was so interesting about it is the other man, who I'm calling Joseph, might not be Joseph, but the person who was sentenced was having a homosexual relation with another man, but the second man reported him for it, right? And so when the sentence was passed, it was going to be this person who reported the perpetrator, quote unquote, was going to stand by and watch as he's being beaten. And so we sort of see from the very onset of European colonialism and Christianity, we see the religion essentially rewarding people for, turning their back on queerness and for resisting queerness, and for, leaking it or exposing it. And the same logic, the same framework carried on into evangelical Christianity, which is how we have like this whole ex-gay movement, where we see people essentially, or the church, or the evangelical church more specifically, essentially handpick certain people to talk about being previously gay. And we've seen a similar thing happen in Uganda as well. So I think all of this just to say that the problems that I think people in Uganda face is fundamentally, of course, homophobia, state-backed violence, but it's also evangelical influence into like what then manifests as this problem that I talked about.
Caleb, it's interesting that how you describe that today, when we look at homosexual community, of course, that we know, let's just start from the US. It's rather dangerous that we mixed politics with religion today, particularly in the US. Because again, you are living in the US today, of course, that you follow that how today social movement tend to send stronger messages to the average citizens. And of course, mainly, most of the politicians should also follow the social movements within the states. Now, my next question, let's go back to Uganda's parliament. You mentioned that this bill was shortly passed. And what was the policy before the bill was passed? So in other words, I guess we need to get a little deeper is how did the members within the LGBT community in Uganda live before the bill was officially set to table? Because we know that, again, for the US and from any other countries, we tend to put the word democracy on the table. And that's why we link to the social movement, to the political movement. So was democracy, or was there any democratic freedom for LGBT community before the policy or the rules were to pass? Or you could see years ago, something was on the way, despite that the missing presence of the evangelical Christians in America. Help us to understand that.
That's a great question. And I think what's a really helpful sort of like way to look at it is this is not the first time Uganda is passing a bill of this nature, right? So that's also something that's good to keep in mind. And if you kind of look at what is the history of such bills, again, it's never been a perfect place for queer people. I'm not Ugandan, I'm Nigerian. I lived in Uganda, went to school there.
Right.
But again, what the contexts are different, but they're still in so many ways similar. And what sort of like unites us again is European colonialism, right? So what happened is colonialists had this sodomy laws, right? So they already extant sodomy laws in Uganda and places like Nigeria, which is why a lot of times people are asking, like, so, like, why do you have to create new laws anyway when they're already laws, right? It's just people feel like what is very peculiar about this current bill is that it focuses a lot on what they kind of call homosexual recruitment, and what they consider as recruitment is, which is why they are like now targeting landlords, is they just don't want you to be criminalized for being gay, but they want to sniff out basically every space in which you can exist. They don't even want you to have a home, clearly, because they say you can't live in a house or a landlord can't rent to you. So where are you supposed to live? And I think that's what makes this law so draconian. But as I was saying, a lot of former British colonies have sodomy laws, right? Some countries have been able to like repeal or decriminalize. For instance, Botswana, which decriminalized same-sex marriage. But I think that for so many others like Uganda, this is still in the law. So in 2014, they passed another anti-gay bill, right, which was signed into law by the president, but was shortly after repealed. What all of these things do, however, is that they sort of create a climb in which, again, as I said earlier, they exacerbate violence. So it's not to say violence is not existent, but it's like everything else, right? When the media frames something, when there's a panic around something, it becomes more noticeable, right? It becomes much more a focus of attention. So it's never been a perfect country. It's always had these spurts and like bursts of panic. So like this time last year, there was not this much panic, but now there is this much panic. And I can tell you again how this whole panic began shortly. But what happens at every single panic point is the violence that queer people face is exacerbated. The spaces in which they can even exist is sort of shrink even further, right? And we saw in 2011, when David Kato, who was a Ugandan queer activist who was murdered. Again, similar context, like there was panic. A newspaper released a list of 100 top homosexuals in Uganda, put their pictures, put their home addresses in some instances, and also put like a picture of a hangman noose next to them, basically saying, kill them, right? So similar panic. But I think, and you see, what really worries me about this kind of panic is people's lives actually at stake. So in the 2009 to 2014 era, David Kato was killed, right, in his own home. So at the end of the day, all of these things that some people sort of treat as a game, or what people sort of see as like, propaganda, or like spreading propaganda, like this, there's actually like real life impact of the. At the cost of this like hustle, there's actually real people who are actually at stake. It's not just a debate. It's not, which is why I find it very problematic when I see people now organizing sort of like conversations between like members of parliament and activists. And I'm like, well, what are we talking about? Like, what are you know what you're supposed to do? Like, what is the argument meant to be? What is the conversation? What is the output of a conversation where you bring somebody who is vehemently anti-gay and somebody who is pro-gay? What do you hope to happen like in that discourse? And I think it's much more. So I guess essentially what I'm trying to say in context is, as we've seen in places like Nigeria and Ghana and Cameroon, when a bill is debated, when panic is created, already existing conditions are kind of like get worse for people, right? So it was never a haven. Uganda has always been imperfect. There have been serious cases of human rights violations against queer people in Uganda always, but the level at which that happens is going to greatly increase with a bill like this at the forefront.
Caleb, it's interesting that when we talk about human rights issue today, that particularly from the U.S. perspective, Christian leaders and Christian, we'll say, icons tend to be very loud and bold to step in and make sure that people understand, besides America, but other countries should also pay attention to the human rights violation. Now, let's go back to the article. Within the article, you also mentioned some of the famous and well-known names of the Christian leaders in the U.S. And also, meanwhile, this is what you wrote, and I quote, "A made in the U.S. movement and ideology is polarizing African countries and harming and endangering LGBTQ plus people." So Caleb, my next question is very simple. Do you think it's fair for American Christian icons that you mentioned, those people in the article, should meddling or should actually get involved with those social issues around the world, particularly the countries in Africa. But because the continent of Africa, for example, because we know that those icons are rather well known in America, but meanwhile, if they don't know the history, or if they don't know the political system or social systems within each country, it's rather difficult for them to make the message loud and clear. So do you think these American Christian icons should step in other countries' social or political movement? And if so, how effective do you think their messages or their presence are? What do you say to that?
I think that, it's a lot of times, and I grew up in the Christian church, so I know, but like a lot of times there's what happens in Christianity often is sort of like a need to sort of justify why it exists, right? And you sort of only arrive at that level of justification if you're able to spin a web of what I consider to be lies. You only are able to like sort of arrive. You only are able to have a good if you have an evil. So when we think of it in that way, the church needs there to be gay people so that they can say we are fighting against gay people. It needs there to be like abortion so they can say we're fighting against abortion. And what it does is it will kind of go to a very great extent to construct these movements as this. It's again like the binary of God versus Satan, or or God and Lucifer, right? There's two sides. There's good, there's bad. There has to be good and there has to be bad. And I think that whether or not I don't think it's fair for them to meddle, but I know that I can't stop them from meddling, because meddling is crucial to the system as a whole. It's crucial to their design. The design of the church is to meddle. The question again is like, in what though, is what becomes the question. But the original design, they will always meddle. And that's why I quoted the letter in 1981 by Jerry Falwell, where he was saying essentially the same things that people are saying now. They are recruiting our children. They Powell. I know I watched the video of a parliamentarian in Uganda saying, if all the boys are gay, who will our daughters marry? Sort of like simplistic like thinking, but it's still the same. It's still the same talking points, from the 17th century to 1981 to present day. And I think that the strategies are actually quite effective. But again, I also, what's so interesting to me is it seemed, as people were more accepting of, gay rights in the US, which wasn't always the case, as we know, but as people got more accepting of it, it kind of seemed as though the church started to like plant its tentacles elsewhere to again spread the same anti-gay narratives. And what you also find when you kind of study, because I also research anti-LGBT propaganda now as a researcher as well. So like when you kind of study these figureheads who they select, or these movement leaders, what you find is a lot of the people who are talking about, like let's say a lot of the people at the forefront of anti-gay efforts in Uganda are also very connected, or also very much share on their social media pages or through their platforms anti-trans rhetoric of what's happening in the US as well, right? So in some ways, what's happening in the US now, which is more of trans people after your children, because we've kind of evolved past gay rights, right? Not entirely, but somewhat. And so the church knows that the next place to sort of like pitch their tent is with, trans rights, because that's sort of seems like a much more easier ground for them to spread their propaganda in, right? And they do exactly just that. But what happens is these movements, though on different sides, the US movement particularly emboldens movements in other countries, which we wouldn't like to be the case, but again, is an output of colonialism, and imperialism, because people are always looking to the US and Europe for guidance on what to do. And that also includes, Africans as well, whether or not we like it. And I think that when people look to America and sort of see this intense polarization with the trans debates going on one side, when they look at figureheads like, I wouldn't even mention their names, but we know the people at the forefront, the famous author at the forefront of like this kind of rhetoric, it sort of legitimizes their message and their cause, right? Nobody's even fighting for trans rights in Uganda yet. Or nobody's fighting against trans rights. What they're fighting against are homosexuals. But they kind of see themselves similarly in that both panics are sort of created and sustained around children.
Caleb, I got 2 more questions before letting you go. Again, not only that your article covers the nation of Uganda, and also you mentioned the country of Nigeria as well. And of course, this is something that you're much more familiar. We know recently this country just elected another brand new president, but again, when we follow this political change, number one, this election caused a firestorm worldwide. So again, everyone is paying attention to the election in Nigeria. Now, my first question is, why do you think this election was so critical and drew the attention worldwide? Did it have something to do with what we called those social issues, or it's only about political reasons? But again, given the fact, as we mentioned before today, we can't talk about politics while putting the social movement or putting the social concern on the side. We know we're not living in the centuries of 1700, but we're in the 2023. So again, Caleb, help us to understand, what was the significance of the election in Nigeria recently? Was it about social movement, or was it about another political shift that is going to take place? What do you think?
It's definitely like a lot about social movements. It's not unconnected, if not a lot. And there's so many factors at play, right? The very major thing I think that happened in this election is that for the first time we had it would have been my first time to vote if I was in Nigeria, but I wasn't. I was in school in the US. But it would have been my first time to vote because I'm a Gen Z, right? And so for many people like me who are Gen Zers in Nigeria, it was their first time to vote, right? And they were also galvanized by, we had the NSAS protest in October 2020, which was a protest against a rogue police unit. For them also, and for people like me, it was the first time we ever saw the kind of mass organizing in our entire life being in Nigeria. And it was a major protest. It's probably the largest we've ever seen in the country. Not probably, most definitely the largest social movement we've ever seen in Nigeria in the history of the country, right? People protested at every single location, in different states across the country. And I think all of those things, and I don't know if you know the story of how the protest ended, or ended, quote unquote, was because on the 20th of October 2020, soldiers opened fire on protesters who were just singing the national anthem and waving the Nigerian flag, and so killed people, and then denied killing people, even though we all saw it happen on Instagram Live. So that's just crazy. And then eventually, of course, they said, oh, we killed 10, not 100, or we killed 20, not. Basically how the military works everywhere else, right? But I think for all of us who were watching, we were in such disbelief. It was the first time we ever saw what dictators, even though they wouldn't regard themselves as such, but what dictators do to people who dare to stand up or who dare to dissent. They try to unalive you, literally. And I think that there was some anger in the ruling party from that election. There was some anger at the governor of Lagos, which is from the ruling party of Nigeria when that happened. There was some anger at the president when that happened. And all of those things contributed to making this election what it was. It literally, and I don't say it lightly, but literally was a fight for our lives. We're literally fighting for our lives. And I think we all felt a certain kind of heartbreak, when the person we wanted to win didn't win. Again, because the person we wanted to win had a very stellar record of he was a previous governor, but he also seemed to connect to the young people a lot better, right? He's younger, he's smarter, the president we even elected to be president has previous drug issue in the US. He's been convicted of drug crimes in America, and yet he still was able to kind of run for presidency, which shouldn't work, and which is sort of part of what is being taken to they're taking him to court, or they're taking the electoral commission to court, and they sort of cite all of these reasons in their petition. But I think what I'm trying to say is this election was so peculiar, was so important, because I think young Nigerians were particularly fighting for their lives. They realized, I guess, some of the things that our parents realized many years ago, which is the country would try to kill you if you try to sort of disrupt the status quo. It was also massively rigged, and there's evidence of that because, again, young people were, there were like independent ways of sort of tracking the election results away from the official electoral commission. So people would take photographs of their polling units and stuff like that. And what we would find is the results that I eventually release, don't tally with what's like, with like independent photos taken, which are also verified. So yes, so I think and I could go on, but like in a very short summary, those are the very reasons why I think the protests, of course, not to even mention the insecurity in the country has like peaked. I didn't even touch that, but Nigeria has gotten periodically and greatly unsafe in the last 8 years of this regime. The economy has gotten incredibly worse. Things are a lot more expensive. I was there in July last year, and I just couldn't believe how much bread costs now. Something so cheap previously, and we've had the most people leave Nigeria in the past year than ever before, like the greatest number of migrants ever, and there's mostly young people again.
Caleb, I want to wrap up our conversation again by going back to Nigeria. Again, as you mentioned that today, the younger generations worldwide are actively participating in the social and the political movements. Now, particularly, again, going back to Nigeria, right now we have a brand new president. And how about the reaction from the younger generations? And also the key question I wanted to get your take on that one is, did younger generations or did the country find the right person in order to find better hope for the future or for the future of the country? So in other words, what can we expect from this new leader? Are we going to see any tangible or even practical changes going to take place in the country of Nigeria?
Well, I know for a fact, I mean, I didn't vote because I wasn't there. But I know for a fact that, at least in my circle, I can't speak for everybody, but I know that in my circle and from social media, nobody voted this president. I mean, there's definitely young people who did, but the overwhelming number of young people did not vote our current president, and that says a lot already. And I think there's something to be said about how you govern people who don't want you to govern them. So I don't expect very much. I honestly expect, because his entire campaign was like sort of built around it's been his turn to be president. He's been a governor before, and he's also a notorious kingmaker, quote unquote, somebody who puts people in power. And so his entire reason for being president was just the fact that it's his turn, and there's genuine concerns about things like his health. He's been pictured being a bit uncoordinated in public. He's been pictured falling, and he's old. And nobody even knows his real age, but even the age we know is still old, And I don't think an old person should rule the country, but I think if you want to rule, then let people elect you. And there's something very sinister to me about ruling people who didn't choose you or who the majority didn't choose you. It actually scares me, greatly. And I think that I don't expect him to do very much. He's also from a party that has led us the last 8 years. And again, the president rules, but the party also rules along with them. So if the party has kind of put us in this black hole, it will be hard to see how he will take us out of it.
Well, again, Caleb, right now it is still too early to tell how this country is going to bring forth. But again, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Caleb. And again, Caleb is a Nigerian journalist, and he's the co-founder and a managing editor at Minority Africa. I strongly encourage everyone go online to follow Caleb's publications. And mainly, again, the article is called How U.S. Evangelicals Help Homophobia Flourish in Africa. Caleb, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure, and I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to follow what's happening not only in the continent of Africa, but also around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.